It's 5:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Your phone blares an emergency alert. The message reads, "National emergency. Hostile foreign forces have launched coordinated attacks on US soil. Seek shelter. Await further instructions." Chinese forces have launched a massive, coordinated attack on American soil. In this moment, the world, as you know it, has changed forever. That scenario sounds like something straight out of a Hollywood blockbuster. But in today's uncertain geopolitical landscape, could this nightmare actually unfold? And if it did, how would it play out hour by hour, day by day? What would be left of America when the dust settled? Today, we're diving deep into one of the most catastrophic hypothetical scenarios of the 21st century, a Chinese invasion of the United States. This isn't fear-mongering or sensationalism, it's a strategic analysis based on military capabilities, geographical realities, and historical precedents. What you're about to watch isn't just speculation, it's an evidence-based examination of a scenario that military planners on both sides have undoubtedly contemplated. We'll explore the likelihood of this event, the logistics behind such a massive undertaking, the immediate response from American forces, and the devastating consequences for both nations and the entire world. But here's what makes this analysis different. We're not just focusing on the military aspects. We'll examine the economic warfare, the civilian experience, and the global alliances that would reshape our world order. Whether you're a student of military history, concerned about geopolitical tensions, or simply curious about one of the most consequential what-if scenarios imaginable, this deep dive will give you unprecedented insight into the complex relationship between these two superpowers. The stakes couldn't be higher, the consequences couldn't be more severe, and the analysis couldn't be more necessary. So buckle up, we're about to explore what would happen if China invaded America. Before we dive into the potential mechanics of a Chinese invasion, we need to address the elephant in the room. Is this scenario even remotely plausible? The relationship between the United States and China has evolved dramatically over the past century, from allies against Japan in World War II to ideological opponents during the Cold War, to economic partners with complex interdependence today. But beneath this economic relationship lies growing military tension. China's People's Liberation Army has undergone massive modernization in recent decades. With approximately 2 million active personnel, it represents the largest standing army in the world. Their navy has surpassed the US in sheer vessel count, though America maintains advantages in aircraft carriers and overall tonnage. China's Air Force continues to close technological gaps with advanced fighter jets and expanding long-range capabilities. But military might is only part of the equation. The Pacific Ocean, all 6,000 miles of it, presents a formidable natural barrier. D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history, required crossing just 100 miles of the English Channel. Imagine the scale required to transport enough forces across the Pacific to invade the continental United States. As military analyst James Thompson puts it, the logistics of moving enough troops, equipment, and supplies across the Pacific would be unprecedented in human history. Yet some security experts warn that focusing exclusively on traditional invasion scenarios misses the point. The real concern isn't whether Chinese tanks will roll down Pennsylvania Avenue, but rather more asymmetric approaches. Many Americans share these concerns. A recent poll showed that 43% of Americans view China as the greatest threat to national security, higher than any other nation. These fears aren't just abstract geopolitics. They reflect genuine anxiety about America's future security landscape. But what if we're thinking about invasion all wrong? What if China doesn't need to land troops on California beaches to effectively invade America? Let's explore the actual scenarios that keep military planners up at night. Let's confront the most obvious obstacle to a Chinese invasion of America: 6,000 miles of deep blue Pacific Ocean. This isn't just a matter of distance, it's a matter of scale. To successfully invade and occupy American territory, China would need to transport hundreds of thousands of troops, tens of thousands of vehicles, and millions of tons of supplies across the world's largest ocean. And they'd need to do it while facing the most powerful navy and air force on the planet. During World War II, Imperial Japan, despite its naval strength and proximity to America compared to China today, never seriously considered a mainland US invasion. Admiral Yamamoto, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, allegedly warned, to invade the United States would prove most difficult because behind every blade of grass is an American with a rifle. Whether he actually said this remains disputed, but the sentiment reflects the logistical nightmare any invading force would face. China's naval capacity has grown impressively. Their fleet now includes 3 aircraft carriers, with more under construction, but the US Navy maintains 11 carrier strike groups, each representing more firepower than most nations' entire navies. America's submarine fleet remains technologically superior and could devastate any invasion armada. Consider the sheer mathematics. A single American carrier group could engage hundreds of targets daily. China's invasion fleet would represent the largest collection of ships in history and the largest target. The Pacific isn't just empty space, it's a battleground designed to America's advantage. US forces control key choke points throughout the region with bases in Japan, South Korea, Guam, and other strategic locations. Any Chinese fleet would navigate through a gauntlet of American air power, submarine warfare, and missile systems long before reaching US shores. Imagine the largest armada in human history slowly crossing the Pacific, visible from satellites, vulnerable to submarines, within range of long-range bombers and missiles. It would be, as military strategist Phillips O'Brien notes, a shooting gallery, not an invasion force. If China were to attempt something as audacious as an attack on America, their first 24 hours would be critical. Military doctrine dictates hitting your opponent's ability to respond, and in modern warfare that means targeting command, control, and communication systems first. Day 1, Hour 0. The attack likely begins not with bombs, but with bytes. A massive coordinated cyber attack would target America's power grid, financial systems, and military networks. Satellites would mysteriously go offline. Emergency services would face communications blackouts. Wall Street trading algorithms would behave erratically. Hours 3 to 6. As America scrambles to understand what's happening, the second phase would begin. Kinetic strikes against military installations, particularly in the Pacific. Guam, Hawaii, and bases in Japan would face precision missile attacks. America's early warning systems in Alaska would be priority targets. Strategic military planners call this blinding the enemy, removing their ability to see what's coming next. Hours 6 to 12. Meanwhile, Chinese submarines, positioned days or weeks earlier, would emerge to target America's carrier groups. The goal: prevent rapid deployment of US naval assets to defend against subsequent attacks. Hours 12 to 18. Only after cyber and precision strikes had created maximum confusion would more conventional attacks begin. hypersonic missiles would target inland military installations, especially command centers like NORAD and strategic air bases housing nuclear-capable bombers. Hours 1824. By the end of the first day, America would face a military in partial disarray, compromised communications, and a civilian population in panic. Former Pentagon analyst Dr. Sarah Chen describes it. The goal wouldn't be occupation in these early hours. It would be paralysis, create enough chaos that coordinated defense becomes impossible. The first day would end with Americans facing an unthinkable reality. The homeland under attack for the first time since Pearl Harbor, but at a scale and technological sophistication unprecedented in warfare. But America wouldn't remain paralyzed for long. The response would be coming, and it would be overwhelming. The moment Chinese attacks are confirmed, America's defense apparatus would spring into action with well-rehearsed protocols developed over decades. The first critical decision falls to the President and the National Command Authority. Within minutes of verified attacks, the President would be evacuated to a secure location, either Air Force One or one of several hardened command centers designed to survive even nuclear strikes. The nuclear football, the briefcase containing launch codes, would never leave the President's side. Simultaneously, NORAD would implement its continuity of government procedures. Key military and civilian leaders would disperse to separate secure facilities to ensure no single strike could decapitate American leadership. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, theater commanders, and Strategic Command would present the President with response options, ranging from limited counterstrikes to full-scale retaliation, including nuclear options. In these first hours, maintaining command and control is everything, explains former Defense Secretary Robert Collins. The US military trains relentlessly for this scenario. Everyone knows exactly where to go and what to do. America's missile defense systems would shift to highest alert. Aegis-equipped destroyers would reposition to optimize their anti-missile coverage. THAAD and Patriot batteries would activate across the country and near overseas bases. Perhaps most crucially, America's silent service, the submarine fleet, would receive emergency action messages. Ohio-class submarines carrying nuclear missiles would disappear deeper into the ocean, while attack submarines would move toward engagement positions. What makes America unique is its capacity for massive, simultaneous response. Within hours, not days, bombers would be airborne from inland bases. Carrier groups not hit in initial strikes would be steaming toward conflict zones. Special operations teams would deploy for reconnaissance and counterattack missions. The critical strategic question facing American leadership: should the response be proportional or overwhelming, limited to military targets or expanded to strategic assets within China? Conventional only or nuclear? And looming over all these decisions is the most consequential question of all. The most terrifying aspect of any US-China conflict is the nuclear dimension. Both nations possess enough nuclear weapons to end civilization as we know it, creating the grim reality of what strategists call mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The United States maintains approximately 3,800 nuclear warheads, with about 1,800 deployed and ready for use. China's arsenal is smaller, estimated at 350-400 warheads, but rapidly expanding. Both nations maintain the strategic triad: submarine-launched missiles, land-based ICBMs, and bomber-delivered weapons. The fundamental question facing American leadership would be whether to cross the nuclear threshold. US nuclear doctrine remains deliberately ambiguous, but generally reserves nuclear options for existential threats to the nation. There's a reason nuclear weapons haven't been used since 1945, explains Dr. Eleanor Reichman, nuclear policy expert. Once that threshold is crossed, all bets are off. There's no playbook for controlling escalation after nuclear weapons enter the equation. The president would face unimaginable pressure. Military advisors might advocate for limited tactical nuclear strikes against invasion forces. Others would warn that any nuclear use, even small tactical weapons, could trigger full-scale nuclear exchange. China's nuclear posture historically emphasized minimum deterrence, maintaining just enough nuclear weapons to ensure retaliation against any nuclear attack. But recent expansions of their arsenal suggest a shift toward greater nuclear options. The most likely scenario is nuclear restraint, both sides recognizing that nuclear use would transform a regional conflict into global catastrophe. But restraint isn't guaranteed, especially if conventional losses mount or if communication channels break down during crisis. What makes nuclear decision-making so perilous is time pressure. The president might have just minutes to decide how to respond to incoming nuclear strikes, or to reports of them that might prove false. It's this shadow, the possibility of nuclear apocalypse, that hangs over every decision in the conflict, creating what former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger called the enormous temptation to end it all with one cataclysmic blow. To understand how we might arrive at a US-China direct conflict, we need to examine what many military planners consider the most likely flashpoint: Taiwan. This island democracy, just 100 miles off China's coast, exists in a precarious geopolitical position. The Chinese Communist Party considers Taiwan an inseparable part of China's territory, while the US maintains strategic ambiguity, not formally recognizing Taiwan's independence, but providing defensive weapons and implicit security guarantees through the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act. Taiwan represents the perfect storm of competing interests, explains international relations Professor Dr. Wei Chen. For Beijing, it's a matter of territorial integrity and national identity. For Washington, it's about credibility as a security partner and maintaining influence in the Indo-Pacific. The path from Taiwan crisis to mainland invasion might unfold like this. China launches an operation to reunify Taiwan. The US intervenes to defend the island. Initial skirmishes escalate as each side suffers losses. Chinese leadership, facing potential defeat and loss of face, expands the conflict to US territories and bases in the Pacific, Guam, Okinawa, even Hawaii, to force American withdrawal. As American forces sustain damage from Chinese missile attacks on Pacific bases, decision-makers might authorize strikes on military installations within mainland China. Beijing could then determine that if Chinese soil is being hit, the conflict has already escalated to existential levels, justifying attacks on the US mainland. Former Admiral James Stavridis describes this as the ladder of escalation, where each rung climbed makes the next step more likely, as military logic and emotional responses to casualties override diplomatic constraints. What makes the Taiwan scenario particularly dangerous is its ability to rapidly transform from a regional issue to a direct superpower confrontation. Unlike historical proxy conflicts during the Cold War, Taiwan represents core interests to both nations, making compromise exponentially more difficult once blood has been shed. The 110-mile Taiwan Strait, narrow enough to see across on a clear day, could become the starting point for the most catastrophic conflict in human history, pulling in two nuclear superpowers whose combined military spending represents over half the global total. But beyond the bombs and bullets lies another dimension of this conflict that could prove equally devastating. While missiles and cyber attacks would dominate headlines, an equally devastating war would unfold in spreadsheets and stock exchanges. The US and China represent the world's two largest economies, deeply intertwined through trade, investment, and debt in ways that would make conflict economically suicidal for both nations. Consider this. Annual trade between America and China exceeds $650 billion. China holds over $1 trillion in US debt. American companies have hundreds of billions invested in Chinese manufacturing. 1 in 5 consumer products on American shelves comes from China. The economic consequences would begin before the first shot is fired, explains economist Dr. Raymond Park. Markets hate uncertainty, and the mere credible threat of conflict would trigger massive capital flight, currency devaluation, and market crashes. Day one of actual conflict would see global stock markets plummet by percentages that would make the 2008 financial crisis look like a minor correction. International shipping would halt as insurance becomes unavailable for vessels entering conflict zones. The price of oil would skyrocket as Pacific shipping lanes close. For everyday Americans, the effects would be immediate and severe. Store shelves would empty within days as panic buying combines with supply chain collapse. Products from medications to electronics would become unavailable as Chinese imports cease. Inflation would spiral as scarcity drives prices upward. China would face its own economic nightmare. Its export-dependent economy would crater as American markets vanish overnight. Foreign investment would flee. Unemployment would soar, potentially threatening domestic stability. The Communist Party's greatest fear. Perhaps most dangerously, economic warfare could include the nuclear option, China dumping its US Treasury holdings, effectively attacking the dollar itself. America might respond by freezing Chinese assets or implementing devastating technology embargoes. The ultimate economic irony, the deep interdependence designed to prevent conflict through mutual benefit, would transform into a vulnerability, enabling mutual destruction without a single bomb being dropped. Former Treasury Secretary William Richards puts it bluntly, "In the modern globalized economy, you don't need to invade a country to destroy it. You just need to disconnect it." While governments and militaries wage their battles, what would ordinary citizens experience as war comes to American soil? For the average American, the first signs of war would come through screens. Emergency alerts, news reports of attacks, and social media flooded with videos of distant explosions. But reality would quickly follow digital warnings. The Department of Homeland Security would immediately implement its national response framework. Expect emergency broadcasts directing civilians to shelter in place, avoid strategic locations, and prepare for potential evacuation from coastal and urban centers. Panic would be the first enemy as grocery stores empty within hours and gas stations run dry as millions attempt to flee potential target zones. The first 72 hours would be chaos, explains emergency management expert Dr. Melissa Rodriguez. Our systems are designed for natural disasters affecting limited regions, not nationwide security threats. State governors would activate National Guard units, with many immediately federalized for national defense. Civilian infrastructure would rapidly militarize, highways commandeered for troop movements, airports closed to civilian traffic, and internet bandwidth prioritized for military communications. Martial law would likely be declared in coastal regions and near military installations, suspending certain civil liberties. Curfews, checkpoints, and restricted movement would become the new normal. Constitutional provisions for habeas corpus might be temporarily suspended. something not seen since the Civil War. Yet amidst the disruption, a uniquely American response would emerge: widespread civilian resistance. With over 400 million privately owned firearms, the American civilian population represents the largest armed force on the planet. Informal militias would organize alongside official resistance networks coordinated by military special forces. Red Dawn fantasies aside, civilian resistance would be a significant factor, notes Homeland Security analyst James Whitfield. Not necessarily in direct combat, but in intelligence gathering, sabotage, and supporting military operations. For families, difficult choices would arise: stay and potentially join resistance efforts, attempt evacuation to rural areas, comply with occupation in high control zones. Parents would make decisions knowing they might shape their children's survival chances. Perhaps most challenging would be the psychological dimension. The shock of witnessing American military might, long projected overseas, suddenly insufficient to protect the homeland. The fundamental assumption of American invulnerability, maintained since 1812, would shatter overnight. As Americans fight for survival at home, a different battle would rage across diplomatic channels worldwide. A US-China conflict would force every nation to make an existential choice: support America, back China, or attempt the increasingly impossible task of remaining neutral. NATO would activate Article 5, the collective defense clause declaring an attack on one member as an attack on all. European capitals would immediately commit military assistance, with Britain, France, and Germany leading deployment of forces to support American operations. Japan and Australia would provide critical regional bases and naval support in the Pacific theater. The first week would see the most significant global military mobilization since World War II, explains international relations expert Dr. Caroline Hughes. Nearly 50 nations have mutual defense treaties with the United States, representing about 80% of global military spending. China would not stand alone. Russia would likely provide intelligence support and potentially limited military assistance. Though stopping short of direct involvement that might trigger nuclear escalation, Iran, North Korea, and potentially Pakistan might offer diplomatic support and resources. The most critical diplomatic battleground would be in the global south. India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and African nations would face immense pressure from both superpowers. Their decisions on trade restrictions, airspace access, and intelligence sharing could tip the balance of global support. The United Nations Security Council would be effectively paralyzed, with both Chinese and American vetoes neutralizing any meaningful action. Instead, regional organizations and ad hoc coalitions would become the primary venues for international coordination. Perhaps most significantly, this conflict would shatter the post-1945 international order. The institutions built after World War II, the UN, IMF, World Bank, and WTO, would either collapse or transform beyond recognition as the two powers that anchored the global system turn against each other. We'd be witnessing the birth of a new world order in real time, notes former UN Secretary-General Aide Thomas Nyerere. Previous transitions between global systems, like from British to American hegemony, took decades. This would happen in months. For nations caught between these superpowers, neutrality might prove impossible. Singapore's former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew once observed, "When elephants fight, the grass gets trampled." In a US-China war, there would be precious little neutral ground left unscathed. As the conflict eventually ends, what would remain of America and the world order? Every conflict eventually ends, through victory, defeat, or exhaustion. If America successfully repelled a Chinese invasion, what would remain of both nations and the global order? The physical damage would be staggering. Key military installations, ports, and strategic infrastructure would be severely damaged. Depending on the conflict's intensity, major coastal cities might sustain significant destruction from missile strikes. Economic centers like New York, Los Angeles, and Seattle could require decades to fully rebuild. The American landscape would be forever altered, explains urban planner Dr. Jonathan Rivera. But the rebuilding phase would likely echo post-Ubuntu mobilization, massive public works projects, creating a modernized infrastructure more resilient against future threats. The economic aftermath would present unprecedented challenges. Global supply chains shattered by the conflict would need complete reconfiguration. American manufacturing would experience a renaissance out of necessity, with domestic production replacing Chinese imports. Expect years of rationing, price controls, and government management of essential industries, policies not seen since the 1940s. Psychologically, the national trauma would reshape American identity. The myth of continental invulnerability, maintained since the War of 1812, would be permanently shattered. A new civic nationalism might emerge, combining traditional patriotism with the shared experience of resistance and recovery. Nations are often forged through fire, notes historian Dr. Eliza Montgomery. America's original identity was shaped by the Revolution and Civil War. This conflict would likely create a third founding, a fundamental reimagining of what America means in the 21st century. Geopolitically, the international system would enter uncharted territory. The bipolar US-China dynamic would likely end, replaced by either American primacy or a more fragmented regional system. International institutions would be rebuilt from scratch, designed to prevent similar catastrophes. Perhaps most profoundly, the conflict would force a generational reckoning with technology, power, and humanity's future. The demonstrated destructive capacity of modern weapons would potentially usher in a new era of arms control, much as World War II led to the partial nuclear taboo. America would survive, rebuild, and potentially thrive, but as a nation transformed, bearing scars both visible on its skylines and invisible in its collective psyche. So what can we learn from this hypothetical catastrophe? We began with a terrifying scenario, a Chinese invasion of American soil. After exploring this hypothetical conflict from every angle, military, economic, civilian, and geopolitical, the conclusion is clear. Such a direct invasion remains highly improbable, but the consequences would be apocalyptic for both nations and the world. The Pacific Ocean's vast expanse, America's military advantages, and the economic interdependence between the two powers all serve as powerful deterrents against direct conflict. Yet tensions over Taiwan, technological competition, and strategic mistrust continue to create dangerous flashpoints. Understanding worst-case scenarios isn't about fear-mongering, explains conflict resolution specialist Dr. Hannah Singh. It's about recognizing the stakes so we can invest in prevention rather than preparation for war. History teaches us that major power transitions often lead to conflict, what international relations scholars call the Thucydides trap. When a rising power threatens to displace an established one, the risk of war increases dramatically. Of 16 such cases in the past 500 years, 12 ended in war. But determinism isn't destiny. The unprecedented destructive capacity of modern weapons, the deep economic interdependence, and lessons from history all provide incentives to find peaceful paths forward. For ordinary citizens, promoting peace doesn't mean ignoring security concerns. Rather, it means supporting policies that maintain America's strength while creating off-ramps from confrontation. It means understanding China beyond simplistic caricatures, while remaining clear-eyed about fundamental differences in values and systems. That emergency alert we imagined at the beginning, the best way to ensure it never appears on your phone is through a combination of strength, wisdom, and engagement. Deterrence through military power, diplomatic skill in managing flashpoints like Taiwan, and continued economic relationships that make war unthinkable. As the ancient Roman adage reminds us, if you want peace, prepare for war. But perhaps a modern corollary is equally important. If you want peace, build connections that make war too costly to contemplate. The ultimate question for both nations: can we accept a world big enough for both American and Chinese influence without direct confrontation? The answer will determine whether this analysis remains an academic exercise or becomes a devastating preview.
This is Bytes of Goats, where we don't just talk about history, we learn from it. See you in the next one.